In 1945, British and American pilots had rained death and destruction on Germany. Now, in 1948, they were flying again to Berlin. This time, they were keeping the city alive. Berliners were a beaten people in 1945. Their fate was in the hands of the Russians, Americans, British and French, their conquerors. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones: Soviet, American, British and French. 3.5 million Berliners lived in a city 110 miles behind the Russian lines. Berlin was linked to the west by a highway and a railway which ran through the Soviet zone. The city itself was divided into 4 sectors: Soviet, American, British and French.
Я вам рассказывал, потому что именно в Берлине и в самой Германии
Berlin and Germany were the only places where the two sides came into contact. That is, Soviet troops and troops from the Allied countries.
И в Берлине тоже. В других местах мы нигде не имели прямого.
In other places, we didn't have direct contact between our two armed forces.
Это была одна из причин того.
That was one of the reasons why Berlin became a battlefield for the Cold War.
Вот этой холодной войны.
Berliners had lived a precarious existence for years. Food was at near starvation levels, and currency was worthless. The black market was king.
Man tauschte also, und das, was man auf Bezug
We bartered everything.
Ich will mal sagen, wer nicht raucht.
A non-smoker who got cigarettes with his ration cards would gladly take them, because he could barter them for something more useful. Naturally, we all did it. Cigarettes were our currency. The black market was the only thing that kept us alive.
British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin had a plan for Germany. He didn't like the Germans, but believed that European recovery depended on them.
We have to try and recreate Germany on a democratic basis, give her a chance to live, at the same time make sure that the security of the rest of Europe is preserved and that aggression cannot take place again.
Soviet military maneuvers near Berlin. By 1948, the honeymoon among the Allies was long over. The Soviets wanted a weak Germany under 4-power control. America, Britain and France were secretly planning a new German state in their occupation zones. Spies told the Soviet military governor, Marshal Vasily Sokolovsky, about the plan.
Он нас собрал всех и сказал, что прочел нам данные.
He gathered all of us together and read out an intelligence report.
Данные разведки показали, что в Лондоне совершился.
The report stated that a secret conference about Germany was held in London. He read out everything that was discussed in London.
Sir Brian Robertson, the British military governor, and his American counterpart, General Lucius D. Clay, had to implement the Western plans.
General Clay was the hardest working man I've ever encountered, no vacation. He skipped lunch because he considered that a waste of time. Instead, he had 20 cups of coffee and 2 packs of cigarettes a day. What impressed me particularly was his fantastic ability to absorb difficult questions that were quite outside of the framework of his experience. After all, he was a professional soldier.
The Allied Control Council met regularly in Berlin. Usually, as here, the proceedings followed a well-worn path. The American General Clay and his Western partners exchanged routine information with their Soviet counterparts. But on March 20th, 1948, Sokolovsky wanted more.
He spoke in a very tactful and polite fashion, in a very restrained way. He said, "Could you please fill us in? Tell us what happened at the meeting in London." Clay replied that they weren't going to look into it. Sokolovsky then asked what was the point of having a control council if they were not going to tell us what went on in London, and if they kept secret from us the various issues concerning Germany. Have we or haven't we got a control council?
The Russian just stood up, and he had about 5 or 6 of them on the left and the right of them, and they just walked out, which was not called for, because when they closed the meeting, it was always done in a professional manner. And the general just told everybody to stay put, because the meeting wasn't over.
The former Allies provoked each other. The West had no intention of budging from Berlin, but knew the Soviets wanted them out. They feared Stalin might risk war to achieve it. The Western Allies planned a currency reform in their zones. It would wipe out black market profiteers by making old currency valueless, and it would tie Germans to the West. The Russians weren't told. May Day 1948. In the Soviet zone, Stalin had merged the Socialist and Communist parties. The new grouping, the Socialist Unity Party, was out in strength. There was even a side swipe at Winston Churchill. For the demonstrators, the real target was the city council, the Magistrat, which wanted to run all Berlin on Western lines.
The majority of the Berlin City Council, supported by the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, believed that with currency reform, there would be an immediate upturn in the economy. In particular, there would be increased investment by entrepreneurs. On the other hand, the Socialist Unity Party councillors saw it as a threat to the still incomplete nationalization of property which had belonged to the big companies, to war criminals, and to Nazi Party members. Generally, to all those whom the Socialist Unity Party blamed for supporting Hitler in 1933.
The stage was set for confrontation between the Socialist Unity Party and their pro-Western opponents. These were led by Ernst Reuter, whose family had once been forced to flee from Hitler. His election as mayor of all Berlin had been vetoed by the Russians.
Es allen klar wurde, dass der kommunistische Diktaturwille jedes Mittel benutzen wird, seine Macht im Schatten des russischen Imperialismus aufzurichten, da haben wir in Berlin.
It was a very tense atmosphere again, full of possibilities that the Russians would try to enforce their power in that part of the country, in the city of Berlin, of course, that maybe the family again would have to flee from dictatorship.
West Germans lined up for their new money, the Deutschmark. Each person could exchange 40 marks and only 40 marks. All other old money was worthless. The Soviets retaliated by issuing their own new currency, which they insisted would include all of Berlin.
Currency and political power were synonymous at that time. And therefore it was so important that the Western currency, the D-Mark, had to be introduced into West Berlin and not the Eastern German currency.
General Clay and the Western Allies were persuaded by Ernst Reuter to issue the new Deutschmark in West Berlin. The new Deutschmark, stamped with a B for Berlin, was introduced in the western sectors on June the 23rd. There were now two currencies in the city. Berliners discovered that the Western D-marks were worth more.
Many people from the West frequently traveled to the East and of course bought up what they could. East marks and West marks, if you can call them that, were usually 1 to 7 or 1 to 5. That is, we got 7 or 5 East German marks for 1 West mark. And as we found out later, it was a sellout, at least around Berlin.
The introduction of the new Western currency in Berlin infuriated the Soviets, who debated what to do next.
Sokolovsky picked up the special phone and rang Molotov. He said, "We're discussing these matters. What shall we do?" We all understood the seriousness of the situation. Molotov replied, "You're not planning to bring tanks out into the streets, are you?" Sokolovsky said, "No, not in the streets, but I'll move them closer to Berlin." "No, don't do that," Molotov said. "Let's wait a bit. If you bring in the tanks, you'll be accused of planning to seize the whole of Berlin, and they will bring out their tanks. It's better to resolve this issue by using diplomatic language."
The Soviets blocked all major road, rail and canal links between West Berlin and Western Germany. They made no concerted effort to seal every route, but delivery of the 12,000 tons of food and coal normally supplied by the West to Berlin every day was now impossible. The Soviets cut electricity supplies to factories and offices. West Berliners could do little. Their only large power station had been dismantled for reparations by the Soviets in 1945. The Western Allies imposed a counter-blockade on the Soviet zone. Workers throughout the whole of Berlin faced unemployment and hardship.
First of all, it was a terrible shock. Wherever you went, everyone asked, "Oh my God, what will happen to us now?"
Stalin's purpose was clear: to force the Western Allies to change their policies or quit Berlin. In 1945, the Western Allies had made a written agreement with the Soviets. planes could fly along 3 air corridors 20 miles wide to 2 Berlin airfields, Tempelhof and Gatow. Seaplanes could also set down on Lake Havel. The British responded to the challenge. They planned an airlift. Foreign Secretary Bevin put his weight behind the idea.
The physical suffering of 2.5 million people in Berlin to try and influence the Allies, the Western powers, in their treatment of the Germans, and to try to force us out, is one which we are unable to accept.
General Clay, the American commander, didn't believe an airlift would work. He had wanted to test Soviet resolve by running an armed convoy through the blockade. Reluctantly, he agreed to pursue the airlift idea with Ernst Reuter.
Clay said that this would mean extreme hardship and how little we could bring in at first. And he asked Reuter point blank, do you think the Berliners will be able to take it? Reuter quietly replied, you take care of the airlift, I'll take care of the Berliners. And Clay said that was good enough.
He called up General LeMay and said, General, we're going to haul coal into Berlin. Coal? General LeMay said. He said, yeah, we're going to keep this city alive.
The Berlin airlift began at the end of June. The Americans called it Operation Victuals. The British, Plain Fare. The airlift had to deliver 2,000 tons of supplies a day. Without it, West Berliners couldn't survive. They had coal for only 45 days and food for only 36.
The airlift began, which was welcomed with incredible enthusiasm. People had such confidence in it. It was really remarkable. People thought, why shouldn't it work? They dropped so many bombs on Berlin. They should be able to drop potatoes.
Bomben hier abgeworfen, da werden sie doch auch Kartoffeln abwerfen können.
Thousands of Berliners found jobs and one hot meal a day working for the airlift.
We were divided into work gangs, supervised by an American overseer. Each gang was ordered one by one to the planes as they came in.
Each of the larger planes carried 9 tons.
We could unload each plane in roughly 7 minutes. That was 9 short tons of coal.
The British hired civilian operators.
There weren't many people in England that had any aeroplanes, but I was very lucky at the time, inasmuch that I actually owned 12 converted Halifax bombers. The government came along and said, look, can we do something with these aeroplanes? And I said, of course. But remember, we all thought that the Berlin airlift was only going to last 2 or 3 weeks, or there would have been a war.
America now raised the stakes by sending B-29 bombers, capable of carrying atom bombs, to Britain. The move was highly publicized.
These are the men whose nerve-wracking job it may be to fight their way through weather and red obstruction. So grave is the crisis that General Clay is recalled to Washington to report on the situation. He is greeted by Secretary of the Army Royal and then is welcomed by Chief of Staff Omar Bradley. On his shoulders may rest the responsibility for peace or war, and the Commander-in-Chief at the White House awaits his appraisal of the most explosive situation yet in the struggle between East and West.
Clay argued once again that he be allowed to confront the Soviets with an armed convoy.
Now, if the Soviets stepped aside and the convoy went through, then peace would continue. If they chose not to let the convoy through, then it meant war. It was just that simple. And last thing in the world President Truman wanted to do was see our country get into another great war. We just come out of one.
So, no armed convoy, but more planes for the airlift.
Since I have been in Washington, I have been assured of an additional supply of C-54s, which carry 10 tons, to replace the C-47s. And this will enable us to build our airlift up to 4,500 tons a day. This tonnage will enable us to maintain Berlin indefinitely while we try to find a peaceful solution to the Berlin problem.
In August, Stalin visited an air show near Moscow. He was confident that the Soviet blockade of Berlin's western sectors would be enough to force the Allies back to the negotiation table. But time wasn't necessarily on his side. The West's counter-blockade of coal, steel, and machine tools was beginning to bite. When Western diplomats asked for talks, he agreed.
Stalin
was very calm. He smoked. He didn't walk about like he usually did. Normally, he would pace around like a cat in his soft boots. But this time, he stayed seated. He had no notes next to him. He said, the question is very important from an economic point of view. But this is not the most important issue. What is more important are the decisions you have taken in London. We insist that you should revoke these decisions, or at least postpone their implementation until we get together again to discuss the question of Germany.
He saw that Germany was going to be divided, with a strong Western Germany, supported by America in the West, and anyway being 3/4 of the total part of Germany, which would become an independent country, and he wanted to stop that.
In Berlin, the Western Allies and the Soviets returned to the negotiating table. The Russians demanded the withdrawal of the Western Deutschmark from the city. They also applied pressure in the air corridors.
There's plenty of provocation. They used to carry out aerial maneuvers in the corridor or right alongside it. They'd be above you because we had a maximum altitude. And they go off firing military equipment, being buzzed and all that sort of thing.
We'd come up and a yak would come head on with you, right nose to nose, and the last minute would peel off, or come up behind you so you couldn't see him and then come up over the wing. But they didn't shoot.
Bad weather caused delays and accidents. The airlift was not delivering enough food, and virtually no coal had been stockpiled for the harsh winter to come.
Mein Berlin, du kannst nicht untergehen. Du wirst genauso schön wie einst erstehen, wenn die Lichter wieder glänzen. schauen Sie, dann ist Berlin wie ein so schön.
Berliners knew they were living on the edge. Electricity came on for only 4 hours a day.
Es gibt kaum eine Stadt, die solchen Lebenswillen hat, drum kann Berlin nie untergehen.
Wir haben dann teilweise
We did the washing at night. Because I had a small baby, I had to boil the nappies and do the cooking.
Windeln abgekocht und so weiter.
If we didn't have an electric iron, then we'd go to a neighbour and do the ironing together. It's always the same in bad times. People stick together through thick and thin.
The Soviet blockade didn't prevent West Berliners from moving about freely within the city. The eastern sector behind the Brandenburg Gate could be very enticing.
I often went across into East Berlin. If you wanted to go out, you had to go into the eastern sector. There were dance halls, there was music, there was electric lighting. The rooms were heated and normal peacetime conditions prevailed.
The Russians offered West Berliners the chance to buy food in the Soviet sector. Nearly 1 in 10 accepted. The Soviets didn't impose a complete blockade, but West Berliners who went to East Berlin were harassed.
We could get out by train, but we were constantly checked here, there and everywhere by the Russians. They came into the station and either demanded our identity papers or searched our bags and rucksacks. You had the feeling that if a Russian didn't like the look of a German, he would take him away.
Tension among the former wartime allies was increasing. The city was splitting apart. On September the 6th, communist-led activists converged on a full meeting of the city council in East Berlin. They were looking for trouble.
These were not spontaneous outbursts from the people. They were, on the contrary, demonstrations, which party members and sympathizers had been ordered to attend. Their aim was to break up the old city council.
We wanted to begin the session, but Speaker Zur couldn't get it started because communist gangs had made it their business to be there. Word got around. We couldn't work there. Some people had already been beaten up, so we had to leave.
Councillors driven out of the city hall met in the safety of West Berlin. With them was Ernst Reuter, who now appealed to all Berliners to gather at the Reichstag to protest. RIAS, radio in the American sector, spread the news.
Because of the lack of electrical power, we had loudspeaker wagons going through the streets giving the news several times a day. They had a fine actor make a tape. Berliner und Berliner, Ihre Stadt ist in Gefahr, your city is in danger. The people came. Hundreds of thousands of them came.
Das war eine Atmosphäre des Zusammenhalts.
This was a show of unity by the people of Berlin. There was nothing else in our heads but the thought, we stand united. We are against the Russians and we support the Western Allies.
Nearly 300,000 Berliners, many from the east, assembled at the Reichstag.
In the view of the Berlin politicians, there was a possibility that the Western Allies might be ready to come to a compromise with the Russians, which would be a detrimental compromise for Germany. They rallied that meeting to demonstrate that the population of Berlin was decided to stand for their freedom and for democracy.
Heute ist der Tag, an dem nicht Diplomaten und Generäle reden und verhandeln. Heute ist der Tag, wo das Volk von Berlin seine Stimme erhebt. Ihr Völker in Amerika, in England, in Frankreich, in Italien, schaut auf diese Stadt und erkennt, dass ihr diese Stadt und dieses Volk nicht preisgeben dürft, nicht preisgeben könnt.
When the rally was over, the Soviet flag on the Brandenburg Gate was torn down. East Sector police and Soviet soldiers opened fire. 12 people were injured. One young Berliner was killed. And the day was not yet over. A delegation went to the Allied Control Council, where they feared a deal with Stalin to withdraw the Western D-Mark from Berlin was being hatched. The Allies got the message. The D-Mark stayed.
Rhine-Main field was busier than ever this week as airlift traffic was suddenly bolstered by fresh squadrons. Here a group of valiant young pilots talk over the day's operations.
Mensch, bei dem Wetter willst du starten? Na klar, Mensch, die Berliner warten auf wir.
The blockade and the airlift went on.
We flew everything. I mean, medical supplies, newsprint, but the coal was the biggest thing, and it was the biggest problem, too. The coal dust would seep in on the floors and the control cables, make it difficult to control the airplane. So we flew with our escape hatches out in the back to suck out the dust.
Big Easy 6-4, I have you in contact over the Tempelhof range. If you'll pick up a heading now to get you over the planter beacon, coming down very nicely. Now you're starting to go a little bit above your glide path.
Every 45 seconds, airplanes from the west came over Kleinmachnow, over the High Party Academy, in order to land in Tempelhof.
268 degrees. You are now 1.5 miles from touchdown. You're approaching the trees and buildings. You're now on course, and you're now on your glide path. Very nice.
We were sitting around, the teachers of the history department and of others. I said, the Americans understand historical materialism better than we. And so we're looking at historical materialism better than we. Yeah, they understand that you have to have a basis of food and help before you can begin party education. The Americans understand historical materialism.
Airlift pilots could fly up to 3 missions every day. An American pilot brought his own 8mm movie camera.
I went back to Berlin to get this picture. Inside the barbed wire, kids came up on the other side of the barbed wire, looked at me in the uniform, came up and started talking to me. How many sacks of flour you got? You know, how's it going to be tomorrow? They got off the subject of flour very quickly, on the subject of freedom, and said, look, he said, someday we'll have enough to eat. Just give us a little. Just don't give up on us when the weather gets bad. We'll have enough. But if we lose our freedom, we may never get it back. And these kids were 8 to 14 years old. They blew my mind with their maturity and understanding of what was important.
Halvorsen promised the children that he would return with chewing gum and chocolate dropped from tiny parachutes.
Es war erstaunlich, was die alles mit ihren Flugzeugen hergebracht haben.
It was amazing all the things they brought over in their planes.
Das heißt, der eine Junge, der war dann auch hier, die mit diesen...
I still remember my youngest boy was there.
hatten dann kleine, wie kleine...
When American soldiers dropped little parachutes with sweets, chewing gum and chocolate.
Bisschen Schokolade, sowas.
Word of Halverson, the candy bomber, spread quickly. He was summoned to see his commanding officer.
He really chewed me out. And then he reached into the counter, pulled out a newspaper, and there on the front page was an airplane with parachutes coming out of it. He says, you almost hit a German newspaper man in the head with a candy bar in Berlin yesterday. And he's got this story all over the world. He says the general read it and called me to find out what was going on. I didn't know anything about it. I'll never get promoted. Why didn't you tell me? I said, I didn't think you'd approve it, sir. He says, you're right, but the general thinks it's a good idea. Keep doing it.
For both East and West, radio was an important weapon in the propaganda war.
Es spricht Roman Kwalek.
Radio in the American sector, RIAS, was run by William Heimlich.
I introduced American broadcasting techniques on the theory that if the audience isn't there, you can't convince them of anything. So my #1 priority was get people to listen. How do you get people to listen? You give them good, entertaining programs, solid news that they could depend upon.
Trotz ungünstiger Witterung und niedriger Wolkendecke vollzog sich auch heute der Lufttransportverkehr nach Berlin planmäßig. Am frühen Nachmittag trafen die ersten Skymaster-Maschinen mit je 8 Tonnen Steinkohle an Bord in Tempelhof ein.
A young Berlin dancer called Christina Olsen became a popular RIAS performer, and later Mrs. Heimlich.
I read the headlines, and then I would make fun of whatever the Russians or East Germans did. Das versteh ich nicht, dazu bin ich noch zu klein. Doch die Russen, die müssen doch das eigentlich verstehen. Which means I'm too little to understand all these happenings, but the public could certainly get it. And it became a very famous slogan in Berlin, and so I became the voice of Berlin.
Werden Sie am Sonntag wählen?
Ja, ja.
Und Sie?
Selbstverständlich. Aber natürlich werde ich wählen.
Darf ich Sie auch noch schnell fragen, ob Sie am Sonntag wählen?
Aber selbstverständlich werden wir wählen.
In December 1948, West Berliners voted for a new council to run their half of the city. The Socialist Unity Party, which dominated the old council in the Soviet sector, boycotted the elections.
Wir sind im Moment als Stadt gespalten.
For the moment, we are a divided city. There is nothing we can do about it. Our survival now depends on developing extremely strong ties with West Germany.
Ernst Reuter was now mayor, with Louisa Schroeder as his deputy, but only in one half of Berlin. For the American garrison in Berlin and for General Clay, Christmas entertainment was provided by Bob Hope and by the great Tin Pan Alley composer Irving Berlin.
You know, you've got the name wrong. It's Irving Jones.
Irving Jones?
Yes, I changed it. Anything over here named Berlin, they cut up into sectors.
Not long ago, a group we called the Air Corps helped win the war and took a bow. Not long ago, we cheered the fighting Air Corps. Let's see what's happened to them now. Operation Biddles is in the way, and rolling in and hay, and everything's okay. Operation Biddles, as in the eye we go. We won't forget to blow against the one.
Operation Vittles, the American code name for the airlift, was working at last, thanks to an unusually mild winter. On Easter Sunday 1949, a record 13,000 tons was airlifted in 24 hours. The gamble had worked. Berlin could be supplied indefinitely by air.
We lived at Karlshorst and could hear the noise of the aeroplanes, which delivered everything, including chocolate and Christmas presents. We couldn't match it. We were poor, and the West was rich. And of course, this crazy blockade was bound to fail.
The Soviets had failed to drive the British, Americans and French out of Berlin. The Allied counter-blockade was hurting the Soviet zone. On May 12, 1949, Stalin called it quits.
As midnight nears, tension mounts at the British frontier control post. Familiar with the old Russian habit of changing their minds when it suits them, seasoned campaigners could not quite grasp this new mood of cooperation. As on the stroke of 12, the barrier goes up and a British jeep leads the race into Berlin.
Many people thought the ending of the Berlin blockade meant an end to the Cold War.
I returned home after midnight, having taken the S-Bahn from Ostkreuz to Neukölln. When we crossed the boundary between the two sectors, everything was bathed in light. It was like a dream.
Freude. Weiter nichts. Sheer joy. Nothing else. We had done it. It does work with the West. That was so very important. The West has won.
It was General Clay's time to go back home. After a goodbye parade, he paid a final visit to Berlin.
So then he asked me to go with him to the final farewell ceremony at City Hall, and Adenauer and all the top German officials had been flown in. That was a very impressive farewell ceremony, and as so often, nobody had thought of providing a separate microphone for the interpreter. This happened to me time and again, which meant I had to lean over practically cheek to General Clay to speak into the microphones. And in the strong light, I could see that there were tears in his eyes.
I shall not use the English word goodbye, but rather try to say to you, auf Wiedersehen.
The day General Clay said auf Wiedersehen, the head of the future West German Republic, Konrad Adenauer, addressed Berliners.
Und erfüllt von tiefer Dankbarkeit für euren Kampf, für euer Leid, für eure Geduld, die jetzt zum Siege geführt hat.
The Cold War period in Berlin was really the core, the root of post-war democracy in Germany. There was a growing feeling that the Germans, after all, can be satisfied to accept democracy as their own ways of living and to become part of the Western world.
Сам этот берлинский кризис привел, конечно.
The Berlin crisis, on reflection, resulted in a division of Europe. The government in West Germany was created, and 2 weeks later, on our side, the German Democratic Republic was born. That division went right across Germany.
In April 1949, British Foreign Secretary Bevin's dream of a strategic alliance between Western Europe and North America came true with the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty.
The overall success of the Berlin Airlift was, first of all, it persuaded a lot of very frightened people throughout Europe that they had to come into the Atlantic Alliance, which provided the security for the general feeling that we are safe in spite of these very much larger Russian forces which were next door.
August 29th, 1949. The Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. The American nuclear monopoly was over. The world was now split down the middle by two competing superpowers. At its heart lay a divided Germany and a divided Berlin. Korea, summer 1950. The United States leads the United Nations into a war against communism in Asia. In winter, under attack from the Chinese communists, the UN troops are thrown into full-scale retreat.
It was a route exactly like the one that Napoleon faced leaving Russia. We ran headlong, helter-skelter, pell-mell, trying to get to Busan, trying to get back to Japan. It was disgusting.
The Cold War has become a hot war. August 1945. At the end of the Second World War, the Japanese army that had occupied Korea for 35 years surrenders.
During the Japanese occupation, they forced us to follow the Japanese lifestyle, speak the Japanese language, use Japanese law. When we were liberated, we welcomed the soldiers.
Russian and American troops liberated Korea, meeting together just as they had in Germany. As occupying powers, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to divide Korea along the 38th parallel as a temporary measure. South of the divide, the Americans were in control.
We made the Republic of Korea, really. Between the Pentagon and the State Department.
American generals installed a hard-line anti-communist, Syngman Rhee.
His charm is somewhat deceptive because he's also very tough. He's absolutely unforgiving, very patriotic, and he's not nearly as sweet as he looks.
Rhee was appointed as first president of the new Republic of Korea in 1948. American troops withdrew. North of the 38th parallel, the Russians were in control. They established a communist regime through a network of people's committees. Kim Il-sung, who had spent the war in the Soviet Union, was groomed for power.
He was a very handsome young man, always smiling. Everybody liked him in Korea. He made a very good impression. He was the national hero of the Korean people.
The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was proclaimed, with Kim Il-sung as its president. As Soviet troops withdrew, Kim dreamed of uniting Korea under communism.
Kim Il-sung understood that to resolve the problem of unifying the two Koreas was very difficult, that he would need help. Of course, the help he was hoping to get would come from the Soviet Union.
In March 1949, Kim Il-sung went to Moscow, his secret agenda to seek Stalin's permission to invade the South.
조선 정부 대표단이 모스크바에 지금 도착한 것은 조선민주주의 인민공화국과 소비에트 연맹과의 사이에 정치적, 경제적, 문화적.
Stalin, preoccupied with crisis in Berlin, rejected Kim's request to invade. By the end of 1949, the international situation had been transformed. The Soviets detonated their first atom bomb. And the communist revolution in China was finally successful. Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. A treaty of friendship between Mao and Stalin created a communist global alliance, opening a second front of the Cold War in Asia. Stalin was now confident that the United States lacked the will to respond to events in Asia. In April 1950, he finally gave approval for Kim Il-sung to invade South Korea. June 25th, 1950. The North Korean army launches its surprise assault on the South.
I remember vividly even today, the day the war broke out. It was Sunday morning, and we heard this kind of remote, the roaring noise from the north.
Equipped with Russian tanks and artillery and directed by Soviet advisors, 10 combat divisions of the North Korean army flooded south.
We believed that we had to fight for our motherland, for our people, for our leader, Kim Il-sung. We believed it would be better to liberate the South and to unify Korea. That's what we were fighting for.
Sunday morning in Korea, Saturday evening in Washington. The Sunday papers prepare to go to press.
It was Saturday evening. I got a telephone call from the UP duty officer saying that Korea had been invaded by North Koreans. And momentarily the remark stunned me so much, and I didn't know what to say. Whether he was joking with me or whether he was really sure.
Senior officials were recalled that night to the State Department.
When the invasion occurred of South Korea, I think there was an immediate sense that action had to be taken. Exactly what that action was to be and how far it was to go, it was not something we had planned on. We had not worked out of a contingency plan for a war started by North Korea with South Korea.
And about midnight, there was a call from President Syngman Rhee. I took the receiver and I said, please ask American government to rush necessary help.
The South Korean ambassador went immediately to the State Department to see Assistant Secretary Dean Rusk.
He said, if I quote him, we felt that this is a matter America alone cannot be concerned with. It is a matter the world has to be concerned. And with that judgment, we have decided to summon the Security Council for an emergency session.
noting with grave concern the armed invasion of the Republic of Korea by armed forces from North Korea.
The following day, the Security Council met. Moscow was boycotting the United Nations because of its refusal to admit communist China.
Those in favor will please raise their hand.
The United States seized the opportunity to condemn North Korean aggression.
Carried by 9 votes for, 1 against, and 1 abstention.
2 days later, the Security Council voted to create a United Nations military force to defend South Korea.
This is, in fact, an attack on the United Nations itself.
Under the UN flag, soldiers from 16 nations would fight against communism.
We were elated. We felt very, very good, very encouraged. We felt, first of all, we felt that probably Korean unification was to come about as a result of the resolution itself.
President Truman addressed the nation.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. The fact that communist forces have invaded Korea is a warning that there may be similar acts of aggression in other parts of the world.
The feeling at that time was that a military operation of this magnitude could not possibly have been taken without the support of the Russian military. In other words, it was concluded right at the beginning that this was a movement, this was something happening in the context of the Cold War.
The United States mobilized for war. The reserves were called up.
At the time we entered into the war, led the UN into the war with us, it was a very popular war.
Everybody was agitated, getting ready to go overseas. There were all sorts of feelings: trepidation, expectancy. There was quite a feeling of wanting to stop the communists from taking over anywhere in the world. They wanted to stem the tide of communism.
General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied Supreme Commander in Tokyo and the legendary victor of the Pacific War, was appointed to lead the United Nations forces.
He was worshipped in Japan. This man had a tremendous ego, and it had been fed for all these years. I do believe he was, at this point, felt that he was infallible.
The nearest troops to Korea were the American occupation force in Japan, few of whom were ready for combat.
The lifestyle involved a lot of leisure. Allies lived through the Sears Roebuck catalog, who bought nylons and whatnot for the native girls and that sort of thing. It was a good life.
The U.S. task force sent to Korea didn't imagine their stay would be for long.
As a matter of fact, we were told to take our athletic equipment and leave everything else behind because we'd only be gone for maybe 6 weeks. Have a show of force in the field, and those groups would go back across 38th parallel and we'd come home.
It wouldn't be that easy. Rhee's South Korean army was in retreat. 2 divisions threw their weapons away and joined the refugees fleeing the communist advance.
As soldiers, we did our utmost, but the overall situation was going against us. The North Korean army achieved its initial objective. It captured Seoul in 3 days.
With the capture of the southern capital, Kim Il-sung won a great victory for communism.
우리는 서울까지 작전이 다 끝났으니까.
When we got to Seoul, the army told us the campaign was finished. They told us political reforms will follow. Now the country will be unified with ease. We didn't think there would be any more war.
인정하고 전쟁이 다시 있을 거는 예상도 안 했습니다.
American troops fared no better than the South Koreans. With no effective anti-tank weapons, the American line collapsed. Within days, American troops were reeling back in disarray under assault from the tiny communist regime of North Korea.
We had equipment left over from World War II. We were in very poor shape for everything. We were not ready to fight a war. That's what it amounts to. That's the long and short of it.
Around the world, America's allies rallied behind the United Nations flag. The British Prime Minister pledged his support.
If the United Nations organization was not to go the way of the old League of Nations, it was absolutely and imperatively necessary that a halt should be called.
Troops from 15 nations began to arrive in Korea to join the Americans in the UN Army. General MacArthur took a gamble to turn the tide of the war. With the UN forces driven back to a tiny enclave at Pusan, a vast seaborne invasion 150 miles behind enemy lines would attempt to sever and then roll back the North Korean advance. Dawn, September 15th, 1950. The largest invasion fleet since the Second World War bombards the port of Incheon. American and Korean Marines go ashore in huge numbers.
When we landed, we approached the beach at full speed. The ramp of the landing craft opened with a bang, and we charged with our guns, screaming down the ramp.
There was a seawall there, cut stone. They had to be scaled. The actual landing conditions were terrible. Part of the city was on fire. It was a rainy day, and the rain was mixing with the smoke of the fire and the smoke of the bombardment. If those beaches had been defended by Japanese or German troops of the same quality as the Germans and Japanese were in World War II, we would have been lucky to get ashore, and we might not have been quite so lucky once we got ashore.
Within 2 weeks, UN troops were engaged in a fierce battle to recapture the southern capital, Seoul. 50,000 civilians were killed in the crossfire.
My house was located in a hillside, and there was a crossfire between the UN forces and the North Korean People's Army on the northern side. Finally, my father told us that it would be better that how our family split up. At least somebody will have to survive this war.
After finally recapturing Seoul, MacArthur reinstated Syngman Rhee in the Parliament building. MacArthur's association with Rhee's increasingly vicious regime caused concern in Washington.
Syngman Rhee was a difficult man to back. And once he was in power, it was very difficult for us to do anything. It was not up to us to change the government, and there was no other alternative, obviously, available anyway.
Rhee's jubilant army was the first to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea.
우리가 다시 반격을 해서 38선 돌파에 건너갈 때
When we counterattacked across the 38th parallel, every one of us, soldiers and people, thought now the drive was on to unify the whole Korean peninsula.
통일이 되는 하나의 결정적인 계기가 왔다. 이렇게 생각을 했습니다.
The UN troops, too, advanced into North Korea. MacArthur's war aim now appeared to be hot pursuit of the invader.
I thought we'd won the war. I shouldn't laugh at this point, but I have to. I really thought we had won the war, and I think that was a general feeling. And we went north with high hopes.
The giant Yalu River marks the boundary between North Korea and China. Across this border, the Chinese leadership followed the war with alarm. They feared the American army in North Korea would invade the Chinese mainland.
If North Korea was defeated, only the Yalu River would separate us from the Americans. We couldn't accept this, nor the risk of American aircraft disrupting the reconstruction of our country.
From devastated North Korea, an urgent message went out to Beijing.
A government delegation was sent to Mao Zedong. What can we do, they asked. We can't retreat. They're attacking us from the air, from the sea, and by land. There's very little of the North Korean army left. Many have died. What can we do now?
The communist leadership in Beijing was deeply divided over intervention. Mao received secret cables from Stalin telling him to enter the war to save North Korea. Wanting to assert China's power in Asia, Mao was agreeable. Meanwhile, the UN and South Korean armies continued the race north. On October 19th, Pyongyang fell. It was the only communist capital ever to fall to the West during the Cold War.
MacArthur had the bit in his teeth. He was pursuing a defeated army. The race to the Yalu was on.
MacArthur was surprised to be summoned to Wake Island in mid-Pacific for a meeting with President Truman. MacArthur assured his commander-in-chief there was no possibility of China entering the war. He took the award of yet another medal as a signal that he could continue the advance towards China. When the president asked him to stay for lunch, MacArthur refused. While Truman and MacArthur were talking, Mao ordered the Chinese army, called the People's Volunteers, to enter Korea. 500,000 Chinese began to cross the Yalu River and waited for the UN forces to approach the border. As they crossed the Yalu in enormous numbers, the volunteers sang this song.
雄赳赳，喜昂昂，跨过鸭绿江，为祖国，为国兵，就是保家乡。祖国好儿女，齐心团结，金抗美援朝，打败美帝野心狼，就是这个样。
Unaware of the massing of the Chinese troops, the US Army paused for Thanksgiving. Roast turkey and cranberry sauce were served up. MacArthur and his soldiers still thought the war would be over by Christmas.
Well, Thanksgiving Day in 1950 was a very fine day. The weather was nice. The typical Thanksgiving dinners were there. We had everything that we would have had we been at home. And it was just a very nice day. And that was the last nice day we had.
Next morning, 300,000 Chinese attacked.
They'd blow these bugles, and they had a chilling effect on the soldiers.
The first aim of the volunteers going into Korea was to defend our homes and country, the motherland. We couldn't allow others to cross the Yalu River and invade us. But also, we wanted to help the Korean people.
As in China's long civil war, Mao believed that greater motivation could defeat an enemy with superior arms.
Because our war was a just war, the enemy could be defeated. Our bravery and our strategy, developed during the years of the liberation struggle, would help defeat the enemy.
The reaction when China came in was that we had a whole new war, a whole new situation. It was a very terrifying situation, and one that was extremely troubling.
In the next swing of this seesaw war, UN forces across North Korea were thrown back, abandoning vehicles and equipment.
We had people on top of the trucks, on the running boards, just heading south. I never felt so inadequate in my life as to be part of an army that was running. It's unbelievable.
I ask you to imagine a situation where the temperature is 25 below zero. Nothing is working as well as it should. Weapons have difficulty firing in that kind of a temperature. A lot of Chinese out there.
I'm not aware of any other movement of Americans that were as futile as that route was. And it was a rout.
American soldiers called it bug-out fever.
We are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival. We have committed ourselves to the cause of a just and peaceful world order through the United Nations. We stand by that commitment.
At a Washington press conference, journalists repeatedly pressed Truman on the possible use of the atom bomb.
It went on and on and on, just like that. The president not being able to shut this thing off. And until people began to think that maybe we were going to use the atomic bomb. The bulletins about the president's press conference went around the world immediately. And that caused incredible alarm.
British Prime Minister Clement Attlee was sufficiently alarmed to fly to Washington for crisis talks.
My aim in these talks is to align our policies in the new and troubled situation in the world and to find the means of upholding what we both know to be right.
Next day, Truman assured Attlee that there were no plans to use atomic weapons.
I think the Americans understood it would be tit for tat. If they use it, we will use it. We had an agreement with the Chinese. That's why they didn't use the atomic bomb.
At home that winter, for many American families, the pain began with a call at the door.
The 29th of December, the doorbell rang. It was on a Friday. I had just washed my hair. And I opened the door, and there was a boy delivering a telegram. And he turned on his heels and left. And I knew the telegram was going to tell me either he was dead or alive. And when I opened it, I just thanked God that he was missing in action. As far as knowing when he became a prisoner, that wasn't for another year. Even though we knew he was in a camp, I never knew from day to day how he was doing. I never knew from letter to letter if he was alive, you know, so I always held out hope that he would come home, but I never could say that he would come home.
Retreating UN soldiers adopted a scorched earth policy. After withdrawing from Hungnam, American engineers blew up the dockside. The Chinese, rapidly advancing, recaptured the northern capital, Pyongyang. At the beginning of 1951, Seoul fell again to the communists. General Matthew B. Ridgway was appointed by MacArthur as the new field commander. At last, UN troops began to slow the Chinese advance.
The defeatism and the bug-out fever and so forth that had afflicted the 8th Army before was eradicated.
From the beginning, the United States enjoyed air supremacy.
When I was flying up along the Yalu in the F-86, the Sabre, we were using tactics that literally had been used in World War I and World War II, except we're flying jets at much higher speed.
When Russian MiG-15 fighters with well-trained Russian pilots were sent to the war zone, they posed a challenge to American supremacy.
Our mission was to go there to train pilots. But later we ended up as participants in the Korean War.
The presence of Russian pilots risked bringing the Soviet Union into direct conflict with the United States.
Our government and the military demanded complete secrecy. We must never let the enemy know they were fighting Russians.
When the US deployed the F-86 Sabre, they slowly won back mastery of the skies. This enabled American aircraft to keep up a constant offensive on ground targets.
For ground attack, we were flying the F-9F, the Panthers. Now, they would carry a large bomb load, and we could carry a couple of 1,000-pound bombs on that airplane, and on some flights, 100-gallon napalm tanks with a white phosphorus grenade cap on there so that when it hit the ground and impacted, it would burst into flame and ignite the napalm. And so we used all of those things from time to time on ground attack.
MacArthur now called for the bombing of Chinese cities and for the pursuit of the war in mainland China. This was too much for Truman.
I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons: to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war. A number of events have made it evident that General MacArthur did not agree with that policy. I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
By the summer of 1951, the two sides had fought themselves to a stalemate in the hills of Korea, almost at the point at which the fighting had begun a year earlier. Every month brought another 2,500 UN casualties.
It became evident to us that we were not going to fight this war to win it, that we were going to fight it to some negotiated kind of peace.
Armistice talks began in July 1951, but got nowhere. Both sides found the other's attitude impossible.
이 공산주의자들하고 교섭이라는 건 굉장히 어렵습니다.
Negotiation with the communists was very difficult. They treated the negotiations like a battlefield tactic, something to buy time.
그 사람네들은 시간 버는 것도 있고요.
One of the main stumbling blocks at the truce talks was the fate of the prisoners of war. Both North and South Koreans maltreated their prisoners. 1 in 3 American POWs held by the North Koreans died during the first winter.
A lot of them were lost to dysentery, diarrhea, severe beatings, malnutrition. Some of them were, stragglers. They were just beat with rifle bullets till they died, or bayoneted, or you either kept up or you died. It was that simple.
Concerned by the numbers dying, the Chinese took over control of the prisoners. They organized daily lectures to indoctrinate them.
They'd say, "We will tell you why you come to Korea, why you have come thousands of miles from your homes to spill your blood for the profiteering warmongers on Wall Street, why you come here to lay down your young lives. They are sleeping with your wives and daughters. Do you think this is right?" And this would go on for days on end, hour on end, days on end, forever, continuously.
Back home, few people wanted to know.
Everybody was involved with World War II, but nobody was involved with Korea. The newspapers had so little in them. If I wanted to know what was going on in Korea yesterday, I would have to get the New York Times, because on page 2, they had a short column on the Korean War every day. But most of the other papers didn't, and you would only see headlines when there was a skirmish or if some hill had been lost or won, So there wasn't that interest. There really wasn't. It wasn't like Vietnam where you ate dinner and watched television and saw the latest battle. There wasn't anything like that.
In Japan, the Korean War galvanized the economy, generating $3.5 billion of spending. Japan, the ex-enemy, now became a bastion of capitalism in the struggle with communism in Asia.
Japan became the jumping-off place for the Korean War. The dockyards and shipyards were used to rebuild, recondition the ships. Japanese electronics, which are probably now the top of the world, really got their start in the Korean War.
In South Korea, the UN held 130,000 communist prisoners. Each one was asked if he wanted to return to his country of origin or stay in the non-communist world. The communists were outraged when almost half of the POWs chose not to return to their communist homes. Violent protest dogged the camps. When the armistice talks resumed at Panmunjom, the fate of the prisoners delayed the negotiations for months on end. As the truce talks stalled, the relentless bombing continued. American bombers dropped almost as much explosive on North Korea as they had on Germany during World War II.
The bombers came without warning. Too many people died because of the bombing. You found dead people everywhere. There was hardly a single house left standing. They bombed the big cities, the villages, and the countryside in the same way. I saw it all with my own eyes.
Estimates suggest that in the north, as many as 2 million civilians were killed.
It was horrific. They said Stalingrad was destroyed 96% in the Second World War, but Pyongyang was destroyed 100%. Everything was burnt to ashes. Not a single house left.
Throughout the war, both sides committed horrible atrocities. Northerners killed Southerners accused of sympathizing with the enemy. Rhee's supporters massacred those suspected of being communists. In seemingly endless violence, innocent civilians were often the victims. At Panmunjom, the talking continued. Spanning 2 years, there were hundreds of meetings. (1952), election year in America. 2 years into the war, Truman decided not to run for the Democrats. The Republicans chose Dwight D. Eisenhower. His slogan, "I shall go to Korea."
A lot of us were disenchanted with President Truman. I somehow blamed him for the war. So when the elections came up in 1952, I couldn't wait to vote for Eisenhower. I felt being a military man, and his pledge was that he would see what he could do to end that war, that he was the man I wanted in office.
Eisenhower defeated the Democrats in a landslide victory. There were changes in the East also. In March 1953, the communist world mourned the death of Stalin. Stalin had kept the war going. His successors wanted to end it.
Soviet and North Korean leaders came to believe it was impossible to win this war, because on the side of South Korea was the whole world, and on the North Korean side was the Soviet Union and China. So an armistice was inevitable.
A ceasefire was finally agreed on July 27, 1953. The Chinese, the North Koreans, and the UN backed the agreement. The South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, opposed the truce and refused to sign. The massive job of exchanging prisoners of war began. 75,000 communist prisoners were handed over. 12,000 United Nations POWs were also set free.
There's no words to describe how elated I was and my friends as we come across the line. It felt like tons had been lifted from your back. It felt like for the last 2.5 years I'd been carrying an enormous amount of weight, I mean tons. And all at once I could breathe, I was light, I was free. Freedom's something you can't describe.
Bernie Gailing also went home. Florence was there to meet him.
I'd only known him 6 months. We were only married 6 days. This young man who left with blonde, wavy hair came back with brown, straight hair, thinned, and he was gaunt. I mean, he no longer had the facial structure that he had when he left. This man that I had waited for 33 months. And then he comes home, and I don't really know him. But it didn't take long.
"54,000 Americans didn't go home. The war claimed the lives of 3,000 men from the armies of 15 other nations. In China, Mao called it a great victory, and the volunteers returned home as heroes. An estimated 500,000 Chinese soldiers had died in the war.
当年呢，这个中国志愿军
The volunteers demonstrated to the rest of the world that the Chinese were no longer the Chinese of the past. China could not be bullied. China was no longer the lame dog of Asia.
In North and South, 3 million Koreans were killed, wounded, or missing. Another 5 million were homeless.
53년도 정전 협정할 때
When the truce was negotiated in 1953, there was a chance for the Korean people to breathe.
조선인민들이 숨쉴 기회가 있다.
But there is no real victory in war. It kills so many people and destroys so much.
승리했다. 거기서 무슨 승리가 있어요?
No victory, but the West held the line. In Korea, communism had been contained.
In broad terms, it was a defeat for socialism. We were unable to impose the socialist system on South Korea, so it was a defeat.
40 years later, at the end of the Cold War, Korea was still divided by the same line.